Welcome to the Sri Lankan Understanding, a platform on which we explore the path taken by Sri Lanka, an island in the Indian Ocean. We look at the past, where we are right now, and the potential and opportunities for the future. Our topic for conversation today is the hospitality sector, and we're trying to identify Sri Lanka's strengths. We have someone today who is very well known in the hospitality industry with a very long and distinguished career. He currently serves as head of marketing and events with Cinnamon Hotels and Resorts. He's also head of corporate affairs and vice president of the John Keells Group. Thank you very much, Mr. Dileep Mudadeniya, for joining us. You're someone who has been at the heart of what has been happening with regard to the pandemic, COVID, how we have dealt with it, how the tourism industry has had to face the evolving situation. But if we go back in time, if we look at how things were in the past, when did hospitality really become a key aspect in Sri Lanka? We're well known for it, but is there a starting point that we can identify?
For sure. I think if you go back to the history, the first recorded tourist to the country is a Fahian, came in the 5th century, and first recorded visitor, and then of course we had so many other visits that came in subsequently. But if you look at the commercial operation of tourism industry, the modern day tourism date back to about early 1980s. It was 80s that actually tourism started flourishing in the country and the numbers were coming in, and then President Mr. Jayawardena first built the what we call the planned resort in Bentota in early 80s. Then of course with the tourism really start coming in, of course we had the 1983 problem, and then of course continuous issues for 30 years. But despite the continuous civil unrest in the country, we were still able to, tourism were able to survive and flourish to great extent. There aren't many destinations in the world, despite of such a large extent of internal conflict, where the tourism has survived. So one good thing is that during this period, the no tourist was particularly attacked in a very one of minor incidents that happened. So therefore, it was actually really started, at least tourism was surviving in the country. Then with the increase of the global tourism, if you look at it at the end of the Sri Lankan conflict in 2007 or 2009, we really started seeing the large numbers were coming in. For the first time, we passed the magical number of 2 million, which is from the global context, nothing much. But then we see the large tourists will start coming in, international brands start investing, expansion of the accommodation sector, and we actually went into the true potential of getting what we call the foreign exchange earnings to the country. So we stopped in 2018 somewhere around 2.2 million arrivals to the country. Then of course we had some unfortunate incidents like 2019, the attack in Colombo, the hotels, and then of course the pandemic COVID-19 has really stopped all forms of arrival to the country. But tourism is a very resilient industry. We have the infrastructure in the country, and most importantly, there are over 210 countries in the United Nations, but tourism exists at least on 160, 170 countries. Every country claims that they have something to see, which is true. There's a beautiful place to see, which is true. But there are a few countries on the world that call exceptionally beautiful. It's like, if you take a pageant of beauty, there are so many beautiful women in a pageant, but then you have also that exceptionally beautiful people as well. So Sri Lanka falls under that category, where we have naturally and also historically man-made attractions, which are driving factor for a lot of people to come and visit, which also gives them the possibility of discovering these type of aspects within about 6 to 7 days, and that makes us this magical island more tourism friendly than most of the other destinations.
So you mentioned the 1980s, you mentioned President Jayawardena and the opening of the economy, and this probably had a huge impact on the tourism sector as a whole. And was that where we can probably identify tourism being focused on in a much greater degree, greater extent? But of course we had the conflict coming in as well, which we also had to contend with. It's not that tourists didn't come, they did come, but it wasn't at an optimum level. We could have had more. So do you feel that throughout this period, maybe the last 10 years post-conflict, before 2019, was that an optimum period when we look at the past? Do you think we reached that? You mentioned the 2 million number, but could we have done a lot more?
I think the real infrastructure and the environment to get the true potential of the country, without no doubt, came in with the ending of the conflict in 2009 May. that was the time where actually we saw the numbers were just flourishing in, the people were coming in, and sometimes the infrastructure we couldn't even handle it properly. Whether the 2009, 2020, whether we optimized that potential that we had is yet to be discussed and debated. And there were a lot of opportunities that Sri Lanka had, and there is something called in tourism what we call the purpose-driven tourism. There's the sole purpose of a tourism industry in a country is the foreign exchange earnings. That industry needs to contribute directly for the foreign exchange earnings and the economy of the country. That's the primary motive of tourism. There could be a secondary motive such as employment creation, then of course a backward linkage, etc., coming in, but that needs to be established. So in that context, I think we would have been more active, especially on the overall destination positioning that needs to be worked on. In terms of the marketing message that goes into some of the markets. So those are some of the areas that we would have more aggressively gone in, but the thinking process actually changed time to time. So then as a result, sometimes these long-term policies the absence of such long-term policies, especially even for tourism, that would have been maybe would have just had a missed opportunities a few times.
On occasions. And this is where, when we look back not only from the tourism sector but so many other areas too, there have been opportunities that have gone by, and hopefully we're going to be harnessing them in the years ahead, because they're going to be added to the list of lost opportunities otherwise, where we are not realizing the real potential that we have as an island. And as we have mentioned on early episodes as well, the whole process of going from from just talking about it to actually walking it, that walking the talk is something that we really need to start focusing on a policy perspective.
Correct.
When we come back on the next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding, we're going to look at certain large-scale investments that are taking place in this particular sector right here on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. Our topic of discussion is the hospitality sector, identifying Sri Lanka's strengths. Dileep, before we went to the break, you talked about the past. We looked at what has been going on from the time of Fahian, but of course, institutionalization of the hospitality sector, which has also taken place in the last several decades, and some of the opportunities that we lost. When we look at where we are today, when we look at what the country is able to achieve at the moment, we just come out of a pandemic, or we are still in a pandemic. It's not post-COVID as yet. How has the hospitality sector stayed afloat? Were reserves sufficient? Did diversification play a key role? How did it happen?
I think it was a very, very difficult phase. I don't think even during the 30-year-old war, the tourism establishment has faced this much of difficulty. And from a cash flow perspective, revenue perspective, overall management, and the morale itself. So as a result, many went into closure, and there's no secret around that. And many companies have completely closed down. And then of course there is this golden rule in tourism, as that once tourism, always tourism. So they have difficulty in moving out of that industry because their heart and soul. A lot of people have in Sri Lanka, especially in this country, we have seen a lot of passion involved in it. So a lot of people have taken tourism as a passion projects. So as a result, they like to be part of that. They like to basically see that new client coming and enjoying. They see that client coming to the establishment and enjoying, talking to them, exchanging these cultural exchanges, etc. So they like that whole bondage coming in with various visitors to the country. So as a result, they kept it in mind, one day it will be okay, but I will come back. So that's what we see now. So the most important thing is the companies who can actually diversify have survived to a great extent. And this is another rule which in tourism is that we always have to manage your cash flows and to keep in mind that every day is not going to be a good day. Tourism is a very, very sensitive subject. There can be natural disasters or man-made disasters coming in, and as a result you need to keep afloat, which you can survive 3 to 6 to maybe 1 year or 2 years, etc. So it's easy to said and done, but it's not sometimes very, very difficult to practice it. But of course certain groups, because of their leverage, they were able to leverage their whole cash flows and then work out, restructure their debt, etc. But of course the others did not have, because Sri Lanka is not a rich country to support each and every SMEs in the country. There are a lot of SMEs in the tourism sector, so unfortunately they did not survive. But of course that doesn't mean that they will not come back. They need come back. At the moment, tourism industry to come back need a infrastructure, and they need some sort of a infusion of capital. The hotels that were closed needs a little bit of pushback, or at least investment for them to start. But once you close a hotel for a year, it's not easy to start immediately. It needs investment. The transport fleet that we have, if you have tomorrow 50,000 tourists comes in, we need to be ready. We are not really ready with the fleet. We need to ensure that that is available. A lot of people sold their vehicles, etc. So we need to get this back, because when it comes back, what we've seen from countries like Maldives and other countries, Seychelles, etc., who have opened up, is that it comes back pretty fast. It comes back in a time where you might not be able to cope up with the demand, because the infrastructure is not really ready out. So there is a bit of work to be done from the private sector, and then in tandem with the banking and the financial sector, that assistance might be required. But of course, it's a good thing that things comes back. The people who have gone into hibernation or moved out or diversified to other sections, they can come back at any moment.
When you talk about investment post-conflict, we did see a lot of investment come into this country, into this particular sector. What impact are you going to see the Colombo, the port city, it's called the Colombo International Financial City? How is this going to feed into the picture? They're going to see an influx of people who are going to come in there. We're seeing so many high-rises going up in Sri Lanka. Cinnamon is expanding. You've got new facilities coming up as well. How are you targeting the tourist? How are you hoping to attract them? How are you hoping to bring them on board?
Yeah, so the biggest investment that ever anyone has made in leisure industry has been done by Cinnamon Group, Cinnamon Life, which is scheduled to open the last part of next year. It's almost a $1 billion investment with a 800-room hotel and a mall, and then of course shopping areas, as well as the offices and the residences, and a lot of space for the convention. So that's basically what's going to change the landscape of Colombo, and so that's going to come sooner than anything else. So we need to ensure that our marketing strategy is also in place to work on that identification of target audiences, etc. So it may not be prudent to depend all the time on the government. The investors have to work on it. But this infrastructure that has come into Port City or anything else that comes in will certainly help to change the landscape. Especially, we have a huge market sitting next to us, India. Last 3-4 years, they have issued over 50 million new passports. And then with the population and the middle rising population in India who's going to travel, so that market is going to be attractive, especially for Colombo, in and around Colombo. So we need to ensure that products and services are up to standard, and also we have a friendly policies, or from policy making perspective, that will support tourism, which can actually embrace the growth of tourism to coming in, when it comes aviation, when it comes to family entertainment, etc. So we need to work on those areas to ensure that the desires and the expectations of the potential visitors to the country, especially from India and the subcontinent, can be taken into consideration.
Absolutely. That's where there's potential, and that's where we have to tap into it. When we come back on our next segment, we're going to be looking at where we are taking this forward, what lessons we can learn from elsewhere around the world, where a certain degree of normalcy has returned. How are these countries evolving? How are their sectors also progressing? When we come back on our next segment of the Sri Lankan Understanding. Welcome back to the Sri Lankan Understanding. Our topic of discussion is the hospitality industry, as we look at ways of identifying Sri Lanka's strengths. Dileep, you talked about how resilience, diversification played a big role in making sure that the industry stayed afloat. In many quarters around the world, we've already seen a return to virtual normalcy. Whether it's new normal, whether it's pre-COVID normalcy, whatever it is, life is continuing. They've realized that they've got to live with it. We've realized that we've got to live with it too. What are some of the lessons that we can learn from some of the other hospitality industries around the world, some of those sectors?
I think one thing to learn is that some of the countries that were successful in tourism is that they basically understood either we close down the country completely, or we need to go take some precautions and then move on to make sure that the tourism friendly policies are in place. For example, Maldives, geographically they can do that because that's the independent islands, etc. So then they have a completely different policy, and 1 year ago this tourism start coming in and now flourishing, and they're actually better than the pre-COVID time. So that's one thing, is to have that friendly tourism policies, to understand from a psyche of a arrival to the country. The second thing is the requirement of continuous marketing and destination positioning in the target countries. Marketing is something we can't stop. Any product in the world, if you look at any service or a brand in the world, have never stopped advertising. Even though Lamborghini may not advertise on TV, but they have their own marketing and communication strategies. So do Louis Vuitton, and so do any EasyJet who would really work on it. You can't stop advertising. Same with countries. Destinations who want to sell or promote the destinations cannot stop marketing, cannot stop communicating about that. That needs to continuously do it, because there is over 160 countries fighting for this market share. If you look at destinations within a country, like in India, there are hundreds of destinations within a country. You'll see the Kerala is separately branding and marketing. India is separately doing that. And if you look at 1.2 billion people are traveling, 80% of these people are still is in Europe, traveling only in Europe. If you look at Southern Asia, South Asia, only about 20% is the people coming to this. So we need to get a share from this 20%. That's all. So that means it's 2 million going to 3 million, maybe 4 million, maybe 5 million in 2-3 years down the line, or maybe 4 years down the line. So that journey needs to be achieved through this strategic communication and positioning, so that we get the highest yield to the country. And Sri Lanka being a small country, you can't have too many tourists as well, because it's a congestions, and there's also the experience, the visitor experience also have to be smooth. For example, they can't be spending 3-4 hours at the airport for clearance. You can't be spending 3 hours to go up to a Sigiri. It happens when 2.2 million tourists arrive. Average time on a Saturday, when the domestic tourism also high, average time to go up Sigiri is about 3 hours one way. And so you can't have those conditions, and we need to manage. Visitor management plans have to come in play. So have those marketing, communication, and then the visitor management plan to come into play. And also most importantly, that the private public sector partnerships in a right forum, so that it can actually take right through to Sri Lanka, to the world, in a more organized manner.
That's the point that you brought us to, a very important point, that private public sector partnership. Dileep, are you seeing that happening? I know you mentioned the industry is very resilient. We've managed, weathered the storm, and we've come through it. But are you seeing sufficient measures being taken to bridge that gap, to open into new markets around the world, to identify new potential areas that we should be tapping into? Is it high-end tourism that we're looking at? Are we looking at the backpackers still? What are we trying to target? Who are we trying to target? As you said, we can cope with a certain number. Infrastructure is limited. We have only a certain number of hotel rooms. We have a certain amount of facilities. Connectivity within the island is very important. To go to the east coast, for example, someone flying in from Europe has spent a good 8-9 hours, and they take another 8 hours or so to get to the east coast. Are they willing to do that? Are you seeing that public-private partnership flourishing? Are measures being taken? Are you confident that as we go into the future, this is going to be the real engine of growth?
Yeah, I think tourism is for no doubt that for the next so many years there's a low-hanging fruit, and it needs to be harnessed. So when you say tourism today, what we are looking at is what we call the value-added tourism, or the purpose-driven tourism. When you say upmarket, there is a bit of a misunderstanding. It needs to be somebody who's going and spending $600 in a niche or a boutique hotels. That's not necessarily what it means. I'll give you an example. Bill Gates last couple of months went into an agriculture holiday in one of the countries recently, and I think Uzbekistan, and completely that living like a local. That was the experience. And the cost was, nobody knew. He went in, and then of course he spent while he was there. The tips alone, after that, what he has spent, he started actually building a cow shed and a house for the family that he spent. So he didn't spend $1,000 for an accommodation. He spent maybe not even $50. So it's not that. What we need is that the experiential tourism that needs to be brought in. So through that, people will actually start spending onto the experiences and to the various elements which they cannot have in their own country. So it's called the discovery. So we don't call them tourists, we call them travelers. So the transformation from tourist into a traveler, where travelers will actually based on more experiential travel and more discovery, and that's the future where we see the millennials are transforming themselves. So we need to understand this shift, and we are not here most probably to create a French Riviera in the country. We are not, our infrastructure doesn't permit that. but we have a rich component that which can afford. People would really market it and again position it. You can sell, for example, an experience with a farmer on top of a tree house looking at elephants coming in the night for $5. You also can easily say $1,000. People will still value that in $1,000 and would spend that, because that is something which will never be able to have it in their life. So I think we need to get into that thinking, and that we have seen in post-pandemic area how the countries have developed that, and that's the thinking that we need into the industry. So that I think should come with the product innovation, which you don't have. For example, in Sri Lanka, we are still selling all our old products, that's nature, and the man-made, historical man-made attractions. Since I was telling this 1970, the last one we added to the tourism industry, the elephant orphanage. Since then, we haven't added anything significant for people to come and experience. So we have examples, for example, with a nice story, the second largest, the most visited monument in Europe is Eiffel Tower, which is a big investment, but second largest is, a lot of people don't know, is the Lankan piece in Belgium. 3.5 cement statue, maybe would have spent about 5 cement bags. That's all the construction cost. But the number of people, second largest place in the whole of Europe, it's about experiential marketing, etc. So I think we need to think on those directions.
That's where innovation, use the word innovation. That's it. We've got to be innovative, not just thinking out of the box, but thinking no box at all in terms of where we want to go, what we want to do. Yeah. I remember seeing a photography exhibition in France once of a French lady, a photographer who had traveled to Sri Lanka, and she had photographed a backyard, an empty atelier with a piece of karapincha and a bit of kirihodi in it. And that was a very artistic photograph for her. Now we would never think of that. Yeah. This is where we've got to look at it from a very different perspective in terms of how we are going to take this sector forward. And as you said, the experience is the future where we're going. Thank you so much, Dileep, for your time. Thank you for joining us. When we looked at the hospitality industry, we've gone through a lot in the past. We've got to look to the future now. How are we going to continue being resilient? We are known, Sri Lankans in general, this sector certainly has been very resilient through its diversification, but at the same time, Sri Lankans are known for their resilience. We've gone through a lot. We've gone through conflict, we've gone through a tsunami, we've gone through disasters, man-made and natural, and yet we've come out of it. How do we continue to evolve in that way? Luck is not always going to be on our side. Action is going to be very important, and that's what we're going to need to see in the years ahead. So thank you once again for joining us on the Sri Lankan Understanding. Join us next time when we focus on another aspect of this island nation. We look at the past, we look at where we are right now, and what potential we have for the future.